Behind the grand doors of the Wainwright mansion, wealth masked a silence so deep it devoured generations, until whispers from the shadows began to tell the truth no one dared speak. The year was 1874, and the name Wainwright carried weight like few others in the South. To speak of them was to speak of wealth, power, and refinement. Their fortune had been built on land, trade, and quiet deals whispered behind velvet curtains. To neighbors, the family was a beacon of stability in a world still trembling after the Civil War. At Sunday service, the Wainwright patriarch sat tall in the front pew, his two daughters demure at his side, their heads bowed like angels carved in porcelain. But behind that polished image, behind the gilded gates of their sprawling estate, something darker lingered. The Wainwright mansion was a marvel to the eye. Gaslit chandeliers threw golden light across ceilings painted with imported frescoes. Carpets from Persia muted every step, and tall French mirrors reflected an illusion of endless wealth. The halls smelled of beeswax polish and aged wood, every corner dressed to impress visiting senators, merchants, and clergy. To the casual eye, it was a house of culture, learning, and virtue. And yet, silence lingered in those halls longer than it should have. The staff moved like shadows, eyes lowered, voices hushed. No laughter of children ever rang across the grand staircases, though the daughters were still young enough to play. No music lingered after dinner, though a piano sat untouched in the parlor. The stillness was heavy, oppressive, as though the house itself carried a secret it dared not reveal. Those who knew the family only in passing called them generous. The patriarch was said to donate freely to the church and to causes of charity. The sisters were praised for their modesty, their gentle appearances at town gatherings. Yet whispers followed them, strange, unshaped murmurs of unease. The daughters never mingled with suitors, never spoke unless spoken to, and never appeared anywhere without their father's watchful eye. In town, no one dared question it aloud. After all, respectability was a shield, and money, a silence stronger than truth. But within the high walls of the Wainwright estate, respectability was little more than a mask, one that hid a household ruled not by love but by fear. It was said that at night, when the gas lamps dimmed and the mansion's facade of grandeur dissolved into shadows, the daughters would retreat to their rooms with footsteps that trembled. Servants claimed the air grew colder in those hours, as if the house itself braced for something unspeakable. And while outsiders praised the family name, those within the estate knew the truth. The Wainwright legacy was not one of honor, but of control, silence, and shadows that grew longer with every passing year. In the parlors of town, he was called a gentleman of rare breeding. His name alone commanded nods of respect, and his presence at any gathering meant the evening carried weight. The patriarch of the Wainwright estate wore his charm like a second skin. He laughed easily, shook hands firmly, and carried himself with the calm dignity of a man who appeared above all scandal. Women whispered about his refined manners. Men admired his business sense. To the public eye, he was everything a noble Southern man was expected to be. But charm is often a mask, and his was polished to perfection. Behind the locked doors of Wainwright Mansion, another face emerged, one colder, sharper, more exacting than the one he presented in drawing rooms. To his daughters, he was not a father but a watchman, hovering, measuring, correcting every glance, every word. Their lives were timed to his approval, their futures bound to his will. He demanded obedience not out of love but out of a hunger for control. His obsession was not wealth, he had plenty of it. Nor was it merely reputation, though he guarded that with iron vigilance. His truest obsession was legacy. He spoke often of blood, of purity, of the family line continuing untarnished by outsiders. To him, daughters were not children to be nurtured. They were possessions, extensions of his own pride, and vessels through which his name would live eternally. Those who worked closest in the house noticed the signs first. The way he touched the daughter's shoulders a moment too long, the way his eyes lingered with a possessiveness that no father should bear. At dinners, his gaze never left them, as though daring them to meet another man's eyes. Suitors were dismissed harshly, sometimes before introductions were even completed. "No man is worthy of Wainwright blood," he would mutter. The daughters learned early that marriage was not theirs to hope for, nor freedom theirs to claim. And slowly, twisted morality crept through the cracks of that grand mansion. What he could not control in society he controlled within his walls. He spoke of God and purity in church, then at night, demanded silence in the halls of his home. He called his obsession love, his manipulation protection, his cruelty tradition. In time, the line between fatherhood and possession blurred until, In his mind there was no line at all. It was this duality that made him dangerous. A man who could shake the preacher's hand in the morning and whisper sins into the silence of his daughter's rooms at night. To the world he was a figure of respect. To those within his shadow he was a figure of terror. And as the years dragged on, his grip only tightened, pulling the sisters deeper into a darkness from which there was no return. From the moment they could walk, the Wainwright daughters were taught that the world beyond the estate walls was not theirs to touch. Their lives unfolded under rules written not in ink but in fear. While other young women their age attended gatherings, strolled through town squares, or whispered with suitors on shaded porches, the heiresses remained locked in the silken prison of Wainwright Mansion. Their father cloaked his rules in the language of tradition. No daughter of mine will be spoiled by the world's vulgarity. A Wainwright lady carries herself with restraint and dignity. But what he called dignity was isolation, what he called purity was suffocation. The girls were forbidden to court. They were forbidden to laugh too loudly in company, to speak unless spoken to, or to write letters without approval. Their friends existed only in the pages of books. Books their father chose for them, books that reinforced obedience, piety, and the sanctity of family. Even music, once encouraged, was silenced. The piano keys collected dust, the strings of a violin snapped and never replaced. Joy was a dangerous indulgence in the Wainwright home. Yet not all silence can contain the human soul. Hidden in drawers, behind loose floorboards, and between the pages of Bibles, fragments of the daughter's secret thoughts have survived, fragile scraps of paper, scrawled in hurried ink. Journal entries that trembled between confession and desperation. Letters written but never sent, addressed to no one, as if the act of writing itself was the only relief. One note, smudged with tears, read, "The house is too quiet and yet I feel always watched. We walk like shadows, we speak like echoes. Father says we are his pride, yet I feel more prisoner than child. I dream of escape, but even in dreams the gates are locked." Another, hidden beneath the lining of a drawer. "I hear her crying at night, though she will not admit it. We dare not speak of the things we know. We dare not speak of what he has become." The weight of these words reveals what society never saw, that beneath the gilded chandeliers and polished floors, the daughters lived like captives, not heiresses. Their father's obsession was dressed as heritage, his tyranny disguised as tradition. And in the silence of their rooms, the girls pressed their fears into paper, knowing no one would ever read them, yet praying someone, someday, might. The world saw the Wainwright daughters as obedient, refined, and fortunate. But within the mansion they were caged birds, their wings clipped before they could ever spread. The chains that bound them were not of iron, but of blood, silence, and a father's will, and those chains were heavier than any metal forged by man. It began with lessons. Not the lessons of books or scripture, but of loyalty. He would summon them into his study, the heavy oak doors closing with a sound that seemed to echo through the house. The gas lamps there burned low, casting long shadows over the walls lined with leather-bound volumes. He spoke not as a father but as a man weaving a doctrine. A Wainwright daughter must belong first and always to her family. Blood is stronger than vows made before strangers. No man outside these walls will ever value you as I do. At first, it seemed to the girls like endless lectures, cloaked in stern affection. He touched their hair, their faces, in gestures that lingered too long to be paternal. He called them his treasures, his brides of legacy, words that lodged in their throats like stones. The grooming was subtle, deliberate. He praised their obedience when they remained silent. He punished small rebellions with cold withdrawal. His affection came as reward only when they yielded, only when they accepted his closeness without protest. Over time, resistance faded into numb compliance, a survival learned in silence. And then came the night when the lessons turned darker. The elder daughter recalled it later in a letter never meant to be found. She wrote not in detail but in fragments, fragments that chill even now. He locked the door. He said the world was cruel and could not be trusted. He said we were his forever. I tried to pray, but even God felt too far away. The house was silent, yet I felt it listening. When he left, the air was colder than before. My body was mine no longer. Neither was my soul. What happened behind those locked doors was never spoken of aloud, even between the sisters. Yet from that night on, their eyes carried a hollow knowledge. Servants noticed how the elder one walked with her head bowed lower, how the younger one flinched when footsteps approached. The air of innocence that once lingered around them had vanished, replaced by a dread that clung to their very presence. To the world, the Wainwright daughters remained untouched, symbols of modesty and grace. But inside the mansion, a line had been crossed and there was no turning back. The father's obsession had turned to sin, and the doors of Wainwright Mansion had closed upon secrets too heavy for daylight. It is said that from that night forward, the gas lamps in the study seemed dimmer, their glow unable to banish the shadows that gathered thick around the oak-paneled walls. And in the silence of those shadows, the sisters' lives ceased to be their own. After the first doors had closed, after the silence became heavier than words, the sisters found themselves bound to one another in ways few could ever understand. They no longer needed to speak of what had happened. It hung between them like smoke after a fire, impossible to escape yet impossible to name aloud. At night, when the house slept, they would slip into one another's rooms. The younger clung to the elder as if proximity could guard against the next summons. Their voices dropped to whispers, breath barely disturbing the air. "Did you pray tonight?" one would murmur. "Yes, but he does not answer." They shared their fears in fragments, half-spoken thoughts that dissolved into tears. They dared not say his name in those moments. To name him was to give shape to the nightmare. Instead, they spoke of the house, of the shadows, of doors that locked themselves. Euphemisms became their shield, silence their armor. To the outside world, the daughters of Wainwright were dutiful, modest, and serene. At church, they sat as porcelain figures, eyes lowered, hands folded. In the drawing room they listened but never laughed. To neighbors, their restraint was a mark of refinement. To the sisters, it was survival. The servants, however, could not help but notice what others missed. A chambermaid once found the elder heiress weeping into her bedsheets at dawn, her hands trembling so violently she could not fasten her laces. Another swore she heard the faint sound of a key turning in the study door long after midnight, followed by muffled sobs. On more than one occasion, trays of untouched meals were discovered outside the daughters' rooms, as though the very act of eating had become unbearable. Yet no one dared speak. The patriarch's shadow stretched over them all. A servant who asked too many questions was dismissed. Another, who whispered too loudly in town, vanished from her post overnight. Fear ruled as firmly among the staff as it did among the daughters. And so the sisters kept their pact. Silence was their shield, and silence was their prison. In their eyes grew a shared understanding, a bond forged not from joy, but from suffering endured together. They clung to one another because no one else would ever know, no one else could ever be allowed to know. From the grand halls to the servants' quarters, the mansion itself seemed complicit. Its walls swallowed the cries, its corridors muffled the footsteps. Behind locked doors, sins were committed. Behind polite smiles, they were concealed. And in the center of it all, two sisters carried a secret so heavy that even their whispered pact could not lessen the weight. By the time the elder daughter reached her 19th year, questions had begun to stir beyond the iron gates of Wainwright Mansion. In a town where girls were courted as soon as they bloomed into womanhood, it seemed unnatural, even alarming, that neither Wainwright heiress had yet been promised. At church picnics and social dinners, the sisters appeared, but always flanking their father, as though tethered invisibly to his side. No young man was ever permitted to walk them to the carriage, no whispered conversation allowed in the shade of magnolia trees. When gentlemen callers came to the mansion, they were received coldly, or dismissed before the daughters could so much as curtsy. Whispers grew louder when one particularly bold suitor, a merchant son of good standing, sought the elder daughter's hand. He left the estate in anger, his proposal denied before it could even be spoken in full. Days later, he confided to a drinking companion that the Wainwright patriarch's refusal was not rooted in pride, but in jealousy. "The way he looks at them," the suitor said darkly, "it is not the way a father should." Though he was dismissed as bitter, his words spread like smoke. In parlors and on porches, neighbors began to speculate. Why did the sisters never leave the estate without him? Why were their gowns modest to the point of severity, their eyes always downcast, their smiles fleeting? Why did they shrink when spoken to, as though fearful of saying the wrong word? Some whispered of unnatural closeness, of a bond that exceeded propriety. Others waved such talk away, silenced by the Wainwright fortune. After all, the man was respected, wealthy, generous to the church. Who among them would dare accuse him of such an unspeakable thing? And so the rumors remained whispers, murmurs exchanged in kitchens, hinted at in letters but never spoken in public halls. The town preferred the safety of ignorance, for confronting wealth and power was far more dangerous than gossiping in hushed tones. Still the whispers grew. They circled the Wainwright name like carrion birds, waiting for proof, waiting for collapse. And within the mansion, behind its locked doors, the daughters carried the weight of knowing that society sensed something was wrong, yet no one would ever come to save them. It was a winter morning when a maid, no more than 16 herself, was sent to tidy the elder daughter's chamber. The fire in the grate had long since died, and the air was cold enough that her breath hung faintly as she worked. As she shook out the linens and swept beneath the carved bed frame, her hand brushed against something loose, the corner of a folded page tucked deep beneath the mattress. Curiosity overcame her fear. She opened the paper and found, to her astonishment, words written in a trembling hand. "We are both brides in this house, but no church blessed our vows. We belong to him not by choice but by silence. And silence is a cruel altar." The maid's hand shook as she read. She knew at once these were not the words of fantasy or girlish imagination. They were confessions, raw, broken fragments of a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. As the days passed, she searched cautiously and discovered more. Scraps hidden in the lining of a drawer, folded notes pressed between the pages of a hymn book, a page slipped behind a loose board near the window. Each letter carried the weight of a soul crushed under its own secrets. One read, "I prayed last night until my knees bled, but God does not hear me here. Perhaps he cannot see through these walls. Perhaps this house belongs not to him, but to another master." Another, "Sister weeps, though she tries to hide it. I hold her hand, but I cannot protect her. We are as lambs kept for sacrifice, and the shepherd is the wolf." The maid, terrified yet unable to forget, slipped one of the letters into her apron pocket. She dared not show it, not then, for fear of dismissal or worse. But in time, these writings would outlive both the sisters and their father, a trail of truth inked in desperation. The letters revealed what the polished walls of Wainwright Mansion sought to hide, that the heiresses were prisoners, forced into a twisted role that blurred the lines between daughter, possession, and bride. Though no one beyond the estate gates knew it then, these hidden scraps of paper would become the key, fragile but damning proof, that the Wainwright legacy was not one of honor but of horror. And still the sisters wrote, even knowing no one might ever read their words. For to write was to resist the silence. To write was to remind themselves that they were still human, even as the house tried to turn them into ghosts. Time is cruel to all men, but to Alistair Wainwright it became an enemy he could not outwit. His once commanding figure stooped, his voice cracked, and his eyes, those sharp instruments of control, grew clouded with suspicion. Where once he ruled by fear and wealth, now he ruled by paranoia, each day more certain that someone would uncover the sins sealed behind his mansion's heavy doors. He doubled his restrictions. The daughters, once allowed the faint relief of garden walks beneath a servant's watch, now found themselves locked within chambers whose curtains never opened. Their windows were barred not only with wrought iron but with his command that light itself was dangerous. He claimed the world was watching, that neighbors whispered too loudly, that even the air might carry rumors. The sisters withered under his control. Their faces turned pale as parchment, their laughter vanished into silence. At night, faint sobs echoed through the halls, sometimes muffled, sometimes breaking into shrill, brittle cries that rattled the servants awake. Those who dared glance at the daughters swore their eyes had grown hollow, shadows circling them like bruises. Whispers began, that madness had taken hold. Some said the young women were bewitched, others that the family bloodline carried a curse. Few dared voice the truth, that it was the father himself who drained the life from them, day by day, touch by touch, silence by silence. The mansion itself seemed to reflect the decay. Once bright chandeliers collected dust, their crystals dimmed. Wallpaper peeled in damp corners, and the scent of rot seeped from the cellar. Doors creaked like groaning throats, and the air felt heavy as though the house was suffocating with its occupants. The servants, though bound by wages and fear, noticed the shift. They caught glimpses of the sisters, thin figures drifting through halls like wraiths, their nightgowns hanging loose on frail frames. The younger sometimes clutched at the elder's arm, as though only by touch could she remember she was not already dead. Meanwhile, Alistair prowled at night, his cane striking the floorboards in restless patterns. He muttered to himself, pacing, pausing suddenly at doors as though he expected betrayal to emerge at any moment. He grew suspicious of the maids, accusing them of listening, of plotting. A few were dismissed abruptly, their wages withheld, their warnings swallowed in silence. The once proud Wainwright estate was collapsing, not in stone or timber but in spirit. Its grand facade remained intact to outsiders, yet inside it was a prison where time stalled, where youth wasted into despair, and where the patriarch's paranoia poisoned every corner. And yet the daughters endured. They had little choice but to endure. But endurance came at a cost, sanity slipping thread by thread, until even they began to whisper to each other not of escape, but of whether God had forgotten them entirely. The house still stood, but within its walls the family had already begun to fall. Death came to Alistair Wainwright not with dignity, but with a shuddering collapse in his own study. His cane clattered to the floor, his breath seized, and the master of Wainwright Mansion was no more. 4 days the townsfolk spoke in hushed tones of the great man's passing, offering prayers and praises for a patriarch they believed had lived with honor. But when the coffin was carried away and the echoes of mourning faded, the mansion did not rest. Its doors, once sealed with his authority, now stood open to the hands of relatives, lawyers and curious investigators sent to untangle the inheritance of the Wainwright estate. What they found was not the legacy of wealth and virtue they expected, but the remnants of a house sick with secrets. The sisters, gaunt and silent, wandered the halls like shadows. They did not weep for their father. They did not smile in freedom. They merely drifted, hollow-eyed, as though pieces of themselves had died long before his body had given way. Servants, long fearful, began to whisper now that the master was gone, about the locked doors, the nightly visits, the muffled cries. It was in the locked drawers of Alistair's study that the first truths surfaced. Journals lay stacked in leather bindings, filled not with financial accounts but with ramblings of a twisted mind. He wrote obsessively of purity, of keeping the blood unbroken, of how the outside world was unworthy of his daughter's touch. Some passages read like sermons, others like confessions soaked in madness. Then came the letters. Hidden in a carved box beneath a false floorboard in the sisters' chambers, brittle pages trembled with ink-stained desperation. Pleas written but never sent. We are bound in silence. We are wives without vows, daughters without escape. God forgive us, for we are not to blame. Another, in trembling script. If this is to be our fate, let history not forget that we beg to be seen, beg to be saved. The discovery shook those who read them. Relatives who had once envied the sisters' fortune now turned pale with horror. Investigators struggled to piece together the decades of silence. Servants dismissed too quickly, suitors driven away, neighbors bribed into discretion. The mansion itself seemed complicit, each room telling fragments of the story. Locks on the inside of doors. A drawer filled with broken hair ribbons. A Bible, its margins scrawled with words that twisted scripture into justification for sin. The truth was undeniable. The Wainwright legacy was not one of honor, but of horror. And for the first time, the world beyond the mansion walls would be forced to confront the shadows that had thrived in silence. But though the father was gone, the question remained, what of the daughters who had lived under his hand? Could they ever step beyond the suffocating past, or were they themselves now bound to it forever? The discovery was not an ending. It was only the beginning of reckoning. The death of Alistair Wainwright did not free his daughters. It merely left them adrift, broken shells of the women they might have been. Though the doors of the mansion stood unlocked at last, the sisters seldom stepped beyond its iron gates. They had lived too long in shadow, their spirits tethered to the chains their father had fastened. In society whispers spread like wildfire. Some spoke of hidden journals, of unsent letters found beneath floorboards, of servants who dared confess the sins they had once been forced to ignore. Others dismissed it all as scandalous gossip meant to tarnish the name of a respected man. The Wainwright sisters, they said, were simply odd, withdrawn, unmarried women who lived too long under their father's roof. But those who had glimpsed the evidence knew better. They had read the words trembling in ink, had seen the hollow eyes of the daughters who no longer smiled. The mansion itself began to decay after Alistair's death. Without his command, no servants remained. Chandeliers dimmed, dust thickened across velvet drapes, and ivy crawled up the stone walls like nature's slow revenge. Windows broke in storms, rain dripping through the ceilings. By night, villagers passing along the road swore they heard faint sobs within, or the echo of a cane striking floorboards in restless rhythm. The sisters lived on, but not for long. One withered away in illness, the other in silence, her mind fraying until she could no longer distinguish prayer from madness. When at last both were gone, their graves bore no epitaphs. No children followed, no legacy endured. And yet their presence never left. Locals began to call the place cursed. Travelers told of pale women seen at the windows, gazing out with eyes that held only sorrow. Some claimed to hear whispers, fragments of a vow never spoken in church, promises of loyalty twisted into shackles. The Wainwright mansion became a ruin, but its story did not die. It lived in rumor, in fear, in the chill that brushed a traveler's neck when they passed its crumbling gates. And it lived in the reminder that some sins cannot be buried, for they rot not only a house, but an entire bloodline. Some family secrets, the old folks said, lowering their voices, rot the bloodline forever.